It's about more than those breathtaking sunrises. More than the future for those we care about. It's about seeing the whole picture and taking a stand. For over half a century, Club 20 has been the voice of Western Colorado.
Hello and welcome to the Voices of the Western Slope, everyone. I'm Brittany Dixon, your host, and today we're going to be going behind the scenes of how Colorado's laws are made, how the whole legislative process works, and put it into practice a little bit. Here to help us walk through some of this, we're honored to welcome former House Minority Leader Rose Pugliese. Rose, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm excited.
Yeah, absolutely. For a bit of background for our listeners who might not know, Rose served as the representative for Colorado House District 14, and she also served as the minority leader in 2024. She has practiced law, served locally as county commissioner, and has a deep experience navigating the legislative process from both the local and state perspectives. We thought she'd be a perfect person to help us demystify how the whole session works, when it starts, how bills are introduced, debated, and what really happens behind the scenes. So we're going to segment this into a couple different pieces here, and we're going to just jump in. Let's start simple, though. What exactly is the legislative session? Who's involved? What's the timeline like? And for the average listener, Rose, because that's what we want to try to do here. Legislative session 101. Help us understand it.
Well, thank you. So, a lot of us might remember from our civics classes how a bill becomes law. And so every state does their legislative process differently. In Colorado, we are a part-time legislature. And so what does that mean? That means the legislative session, so when we open and when we close, is about 120 days. That is in the Constitution of Colorado, that it can be more than 120 days. And 120 days is not just business days. It includes weekends. And we have worked on Saturdays and Sundays at some points to get the work done. So 120 days. And basically, at the beginning of legislative session, we all work to have bills introduced that we believe are really important for our constituencies. We try to focus, a lot of us, and I'll speak from my experience, I very much wanted to be a bipartisan legislator because I really do think having both perspectives, Democrat and Republican perspectives, makes the best legislation. And we all have different constituencies. And so being able to bring those voices together and come up with laws that actually help and affect people from across the state is really important, I believe. Yeah. And so I'm really proud of the work that I was able to do to kind of bring both sides together and find solutions on things like lowering property tax. Really good work that's being done by legislators in our Colorado House and Senate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know here at Club 20, bipartisan or nonpartisan is so important to us. We want to focus on those issues. And I'm sure as a state elected official who is representing a district, you also feel the need to represent all of Colorado as well. And your district might be torn, red, blue, whatever it might look like, but you want to make sure that you're representing your constituency to the best that you can. And that also includes the rest of the people in Colorado as well. And I know that you work very closely with a lot of our Western Slopers as well, being a commissioner out here and knowing the way of the land. So I know it's a special place in your heart as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So after you were elected, what was it like watching the calendar, the bills, the deadlines, especially as the minority leader, and maybe kind of explain what some of those positions are and how they kind of work together?
Absolutely. So I was elected in 2022 to represent my district, which at the time, even though I had governed for years on the Western Slope, I had moved to Colorado Springs, and I had a district in Colorado Springs. And when I was elected, you're also, you have elections within your caucus. So you have Republicans and Democrats. You could have some unaffiliated, but generally Republicans and Democrats. And amongst yourselves, after you're elected by your people for your position, you then get together as your caucus. So Republican caucus, all the Republicans that are elected, Democrat caucus, all the Democrats that are elected, and decide on who your leaders will be For generally, it's the next 2 years, which in the House, we have 2-year terms. So you can run up to 4 terms, so a total of 8 years every 2 years. In the Senate, it's 2 4-year terms, so every 4 years, up to 2 terms, 8 years. So, but for the House side, which is the side I was on, we were able to really elect our leadership. And I was incredibly privileged and honored as a freshman, before I was even sworn in, to be elected by my peers in my Republican caucus to be the assistant minority leader at that time. And then that following year, I was elected as the minority leader. And then after I won re-election, was re-elected as the minority leader again at the end of 2024 for 2025. And so generally they're on 2-year terms. Mine was a little more scattered, which is not typical, but it was really incredible to have the opportunity to really help shape policy and discussions with the majority and represent my caucus members. For me, when I was minority leader, my priority was making sure that my caucus members and their bills that were priorities to them were heard and given fair hearings and able to progress through the process. Not everything is going to pass, but I wanted to make sure that their priorities, especially for their constituents, were able to be brought through the legislative process. And so it takes a lot of work with the majority in order to make that happen. And you also have, as minority leader, one of the most fun parts of my job are appointments to committees for my caucus members. But then there are a lot of appointments to different committees throughout Colorado. And so I was able to work to make sure that voices from across the state, one of the things we always say is on our name badges, it doesn't say Rose Pugliese, House District 14, which is what I represented previously. It says Rose Pugliese, State Representative. And that's because you are supposed to be finding policies that are not just good for your district, but for the citizens of Colorado as a whole. And so I know I took that very seriously. We have a lot of people in the different caucuses on both sides that take that responsibility to listen to all voices, rural and urban, and make sure that we bring those voices forward. And so working together to prioritize bills, making sure that the voices of our constituents were heard, those were definitely my priorities, especially as minority leader, but also as just a representative.
Yeah, certainly. And, let's talk a little bit about, because working bipartisan can be tricky, but you also have to worry about working with the other chamber as well. So let's talk about the makeup at the legislature and kind of what that looks like on the Senate side and on the House side, and how that breaks it up a little bit.
Sure. So there are 100 total representatives, 65 in the House and then 35 in the Senate. And so for us on the House side and on the Senate side, there are majority Democrats on both sides. And on the House side there were 21 or 22 caucus members for me on my side. And so it takes 33 to pass a bill in the House. And so obviously Republicans can't do it on our own. And so that's really where you understand how important it is to bring bipartisan ideas together and to work with the other side. And sometimes, there are people within my own caucus who don't necessarily think that that is good for Colorado. But, I would say I grew up in politics on the Western Slope, and we understand how important it is to really bring forward ideas from across the state and across our districts. And so I think bipartisan really is truly the best way to govern Colorado as we're moving forward. And I know it's one of the things I love about Club 20, because there really are so many different voices at the table. And it's so important that we bring those different voices on issues that are important to us. And so I think we were really able to come together in order to pass bills, because you can't pass a bill unless you have some bipartisan support. And so I think that's really important. Although I will say, in my time, which is almost unheard of, was one all-Republican bill on property taxes. Now Senator Lisa Frizzell and Senator Baisley and myself that had done it for counties, and we were able to pass an all-Republican bill. That's generally unheard of. But it was a policy, and it was really important for counties throughout Colorado. And so we were able to pass that. But generally, In order to pass, you do need, for a Republican, you need some Democrat support if you're going to get a bill all the way through.
Yeah, and I think even though there were only Republican names on there, I'm sure you guys did good stakeholder work, and that encompassed more than just, say, Republicans, or more than just for a Democrats, you know? And I think that's so unique, because being able to pull in those voices is what's so important, because as legislators, you need to be able to hear from everybody so you know that you're doing the right thing, or you know that you're on the right track, and that you can work together, because these will ultimately be coming down. These bills that are passing at the Capitol will be coming down outside of that space and outside of that building, which um, is something that we really try to push forward. Is, you know, that outside work and that stakeholder work is so important. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So that's always something that's really important to us. And you mentioned that, you know, it's 120 days. That clock doesn't seem very long. And I know that there's lots of long hours. I mean, I've been at the Capitol till 1 or 2 in the morning, and you guys are there way later than I am. And on the weekends and during holidays, I mean, you guys just really put in the work. So during those 120 days, the clock starts ticking. How do ideas turn into bills? What does it look like behind the scenes before we get to see them as introduced legislation?
So I would say, you know, we always talk about it being a part-time legislature, but really, truly, there is a lot of work that goes on when we're not at the Capitol. So legislative session will end. It goes from January until May. Legislative session will end, and that's when we have the ability to go within our districts, within the state, and to talk to stakeholders, to find out the issues that are important, start working on language. What does that look like, right? Because you can have an idea, but as they say, the devil's in the details. Yeah, and looking for unintended consequences of legislation, right? We don't want to put something in place that ultimately we think helps people, but hurts people in the end. And so making sure that you've got different ideas and perspectives, so that you're all at the table, that you have the right people at the table in order to make sure you're making the best policies, and then working with staff. The minority office and the majority office both have staff that work full time, even when we are not at the legislature. And so they're able to help us with the different policy ideas, or you might have an idea, but you don't even know where to start. And so making sure that you're, you know, who do I talk to? How do I get in touch with the right agencies or departments or stakeholder groups? All of that's really important. And I'm incredibly proud of the staff that we had in the minority office, but I do know that they have some really great staff in the majority office as well. And so being able to then talk to other legislators. So really, truly, and we'll get to this a little bit more later, I'm sure. But if there's one thing I can say, these positions, I'm a policy geek, so I love the policy. But it's more than just making good policy. It's developing relationships with your own caucus, with people across the aisle, with stakeholders across the state, and making sure that you can think about the different perspectives and then bring them together into a bill that becomes law, right? Developing those relationships. We spend a lot of time, and people don't realize this, but we spend a lot of time in the interim when we're not in session, meeting with our fellow legislators on both sides of the aisle and getting to know what their personal lives are like and where you have points of commonality, right? And so I know that the people that I clicked with on both my caucus and then on the other side were people where we had similar experiences or something brought us together, and we were able to come up with good policy based on our own life experiences, and then being able to bring others to the table that shared those experiences in order to develop good policy. And so there's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes before the bill comes on bill paper. And you'll always hear, and I know on the Western Slope we felt like this. I know in a lot of rural parts of the state, they feel like maybe their voices aren't incorporated in some pieces of this legislation. But that's where it goes back to building those relationships, so that you are included in those conversations early on as the policy is developing, so that you don't just see it come across your desk in January after it's introduced, but that you actually have a stake in developing some of these bills. Now, each legislator gets 5 bills. And so 100 people, that's 500 bills. And there'll be people who ask, well, you passed more than 5 bills, or you were on more than 5 bills. Your 5 bills only count if in the house that you're in or in the chamber that you're in. So when you're in the house, I get 5 House bills, but I can be on as many Senate bills as I want to. And so it's really important that we have people on both sides of the aisle in both chambers, both the House and the Senate, working together in order to get these bills done and get them through the full process. Because once they pass the House, they have to go to the Senate, and they can't go to the Senate without a Senate sponsor, and they can't go to the House without a House sponsor. So there has to be some collaboration throughout this process. And sometimes, and this happened to me a couple of times, when I was on the Education Committee, which I loved on my first year, I would read through a bill that was coming to our committee, and it was something that I felt really passionate about. And actually, it was the school lunch program and making sure kids had enough time to eat lunch. And it was an all-Democrat bill. There were no Republicans on there. And so I had asked to join the bill and be able to bring my perspective as a single mom that's got 2 kids in at that time in public school. I wanted to make sure that my perspective and that of my constituents was being heard. And so sometimes you jump on bills, and that happened a lot in the Education Committee. I will say it was a really bipartisan committee. I think agriculture is also a really bipartisan committee. There's some that are a little bit more political than others. But on the Education Committee, I really did feel like we tried to come together in a very bipartisan way in order to get good educational policy through. And so, and like I said, I also feel like that on the Ag Committee. I feel like they do the same thing. And so anyway, developing relationships, working across the aisle, coming up with policy, and listening to stakeholders from across the state, that's really the bulk of what we do before we ever get to bill paper, and you all get to see that.
Okay, yes, absolutely. And it's a very complicated process, and that's one of the reasons why we're doing this. So let's say we have a bill now, right? So what's next? How does it navigate through committees? You mentioned people getting assigned to different committees, and that was one of your roles, and then debating on the floor, amendments and votes. Where does that public input and participation come in now that we've seen it as the public or as stakeholders? For those that are unfamiliar, what role do those committees play in the process, and how are these bills assigned to those committees?
So there are several different committees, and they're not exactly the same on the House and the Senate side. Their titles might be a little bit different, but in general, education, agriculture, judiciary. So, and there's plenty of other committees. And so the majority, generally the Speaker of the House, once you've decided that your bill is final, and when I say final, they're never really final, right? But final enough to get out into the public, we get to decide as legislators when the public sees our bills. And our bills then are ready for introduction. The Speaker will read it. They say read it across the desk. So it basically is on the House floor and the Senate floor. It's where the bills get introduced into the process, and then they get assigned to a committee. And generally, I would say probably about 95% of the time, they get assigned to the committee that makes sense, right? There's a couple of times you're like, how did that get in that committee? But for the most part, generally, the majority has that power to decide which committee it goes to. And then that committee has a committee schedule, and they decide when the hearing should happen. And a lot of times they work with the sponsors to make sure that our witnesses, our people who helped us develop these bills, are able to attend these hearings, and their public hearings are televised. You can watch it, and you can testify both at the Capitol and remotely, and be able to get your voice heard on the record, which is really important. You can also send in letters. I know we'll probably get into more of this later. I'm getting maybe a little bit into the details, but you can send letters to the committee, and they can read them, and they'll put it into the record as well. And then these committees will meet. They'll hear all the testimony. And so they hear from the sponsors first. This is why I'm running this bill. This is what this bill does. They get asked questions by committee members. And don't think that those questions are like, easy, softball questions. I know some of my hardest questions have come sometimes from my own caucus members. So it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on. Sometimes you can be interrogated for a bill, or sometimes people will say, hey, this really affected me in my district, and so I'm really glad that you brought this bill. Generally, in the end, everybody's incredibly respectful, I would say, for the most part, and really just wants to make sure that they understand what they're voting on. And then at that time, only the committee members get to vote. So even though I'm in the legislature, if I am not on that committee, I don't get to vote on my own bill in that first committee. And then if a majority of it say that it passes, then it can go through the process And sometimes it requires a second committee if it has fiscal implications. There's a committee called appropriations. So if there's any cost to your bill, because there are a lot of bills and a lot of them do have some cost to the state, if there's any cost, then that needs to be discussed so that people can understand how much is this going to cost the state? Where is the money coming from? Do we have the money to fund these programs? So all of that happens. So now you get through all of your committees, and then assuming it passes through, it will then go to the floor for debate. And so that's called second reading. So basically the bill has gone through committees. The sponsors will talk to the whole chamber, so all 65 in the House, about the bill and tell them what it does and why. And then people get to talk about your bill. And sometimes they ask questions. Sometimes they say nice things. Sometimes they say not so nice things. Sometimes they don't understand the implications of the bill. And so you have to kind of make sure everybody's on track, because it's really easy sometimes to get caught up in a concept versus what the bill actually does. And I remember for a few bills where I'd be like, that's great, but that's not what this bill does. Let me tell you what my bill does. So there's lots of great conversations on both sides of the aisle. I've seen it on both sides of the aisle. Lots of great conversations. And then after the debate's over, we're able to then go to third reading. You also on second reading can make amendments. So let's say there was something I didn't think about in a bill that affects someone's district, whether that's a Republican or Democrat, doesn't matter. And they say, hey, I want to make your bill better, but I don't think you were thinking through the impact this is going to have on my constituents. So can we work together on an amendment that would make your bill better? And sometimes we work on amendments, right? This is politics, that don't make the bill better. And so as the sponsors, you get to decide, do I want to accept this amendment or not? There's lots of debate. We vote on the amendments, and then they either come on or off. So just because you're a sponsor and don't like an amendment doesn't mean that amendment doesn't get on your bill. Although in my experience, I have really tried to, especially if I personally was running amendments, because I like that, especially for local government, I would see a bill and I'd be like, whoa, 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 but this isn't actually how it works. So what if we clean this up here and make it a little bit stronger there? And I would really try to reach out to sponsors. This actually happened on an opioid bill. And I was like, hey, you're missing this part of the process. Can I help you, from my experience, make this bill better? I love your bill, but I can't vote for it because the process isn't right. And so we worked together, Democrats and Republicans on both sides of the aisle, to make this bill the best bill for schools. It was an opioid bill related to education. And so being able to have those ideas and work through them in advance generally is the best way to get your amendment passed, right? But we do a lot of it on the floor. And sometimes when you're in the minority, right, they say the majority gets its way, but the minority gets its say. It's about 90% true. But sometimes, we'll have a stack of amendments to a bill that we don't like as much or want to see go in a different direction. And so you have to debate every single one of those amendments. And sometimes they take them and sometimes they don't. So, and then ultimately, if the amendments are passed onto the bill, then when we go into third reading, that is the final step in the process, at least from the legislative process, then that is the vote. And sometimes you can make amendments even on third reading, but there's very strict rules on how to do that. And unless you're in the last 10 days of session, so we'll talk about that, because then all the rules are out of whack in the last 10 days of session, because we got to get these bills through. So the timeframes are all shortened. But generally on third reading, very strict criteria as to how you can get an amendment, even on your own bill. And then both sides, everyone gets to vote, and they decide if the bill moves forward or not. If it's started in the House, then it will go on to the Senate. Then it goes through their same process. It gets introduced, it gets assigned to committee, it gets to go through appropriations if there's a fiscal impact, and then it goes through second reading, amendments, third reading. But then if they make amendments in the Senate on your bill, it has to go back through the House so that those amendments get accepted or rejected. And so then there's a whole process there. People think that, I think that there's sometimes this perception that these bills go through the process very quickly. That is generally not the case. I mean, the last 10 days of session is maybe an exception, but a lot of work has been done before those last 10 days of session actually come into effect. And so hopefully those bills, we try not to wait until the last minute for bills, but you have 120 days and you have to try to get your constituents' voices heard. And so where that falls in the process and how it goes, sometimes it falls in that last 10 days. But truly a lot of conversations, a lot of collaboration. There's some bills that just go through the process, right? There's something where everybody's like, we all agree, let's just push this through. And when I say push it through, it just means it's gone through the process and everybody agrees this is the right policy and we need to move forward. And while not everybody might vote 100% on that bill, there maybe isn't a lot of talk about amendments on that bill or a lot of discussion on the policy, or sometimes it's just something where we just can't agree. Sometimes we spend some time on it, or sometimes we just say, hey, we're just never going to get here. Let's move on to a topic that needs more debate. And so it really just depends on the schedule. There's a lot of rules. There's a very thick rule book, and I can get into rules from a minority leader perspective. I'm sure the majority has a different perspective, but making sure that we have an opportunity, especially in the minority, to get our voices heard is really important. Funny, you all understand, right? Sometimes it's not Republican versus Democrat. Sometimes it's rural versus urban, right? And so making sure that voices are heard and we have that opportunity for debate, or to put things on the record, where severance tax is one that I, always was really passionate about, making sure that people understand the impact of sweeping severance tax in those communities that really need it. Those are things that are not a Republican or a Democrat issue. Those are things that are definitely rural issues that we see, I think, a lot more than the urban areas do. And so making sure they understand the different perspectives and the impacts it has on these communities is really important, even if you wind up not winning the fight. And a lot of times I didn't win that fight. But continuously bringing it up is really important to make sure that all of our voices throughout the state are heard.
Yeah, and I mean it's apparent that this process is the way that it is to make sure that there are those kind of backstops to have that opportunity to educate and to learn and to ask those questions. In those committees, you were talking about those people asking you questions and how some amendments can come out of there because you didn't think of something. You were so maybe in the details of what the bill did and all those things, but you didn't consider this part. So having Democrats and Republicans and from both the chambers and everything involved, I mean, it just brings in all of those different perspectives as well as all the stakeholders that you're meeting with. And I mean, the process is just ever going and it feels like it's just continuously just going around in circles like, oh, but it's back in the Senate now, it's back in the House, and it's back in this committee. And how does this work? And so I think you laid out that path really clearly for us. You did mention bills going into appropriations. So I think we need to talk about the elephant in the room, the long bill. So for some of those bills that might get introduced early on in the session, there tends to be bills that aren't necessarily attached to a fiscal note, right? Because those are the bills that don't need to wait for the long bill. But before we kind of dive into that part, what is the long bill and what does it mean once the long bill is officially passed?
Yes. So, okay, a couple of things that I think are really important. So long bill is basically the budget. So when we talk about the state budget, the bill that makes the budget happen is the long bill. There is a committee that is only and solely focused on the budget. Why? Because it's a lot. And so we've got some really great Joint Budget Committee members. Rick Taggart is from the Western Slope, and he was our House appointee. I was able to appoint him twice to the Joint Budget Committee. And so what they do is they work through the budget. And they're a year-round committee. So talk about a full-time job. That one probably kind of really is. So they work throughout the year in order to understand the budget impacts. They have presentations from different departments and different programs. And the governor proposes his budget. And all of that goes through the Joint Budget Committee, all public hearings. You can watch every single part of this. And so those people work together to make sure that there is a budget that they can put forward to the rest of us that we get to vote on. And, we aren't going to know all of the details because we've been working on Education Committee and Agriculture Committee and in our areas of specification. But those people, that is all they do is budget. And so when the budget comes, we get to then say, well, wait, what about my constituents? We need this. Or they're going to sweep severance tax, and I think that's bad, and I think you need to look at that again. And so can we take that part out? And so there are amendments to the budget, just like any other bill. Last year on the House side, we debated the budget for 12 hours, and mostly Republicans talking about the things we loved and the things we hated and how we can make this bill better. but we don't necessarily have spent the time to go through the budget the way the Joint Budget Committee does. And the one interesting fun fact about the Joint Budget Committee is that the Joint Budget Committee recommends bills as well, including the budget, and they cannot put the Joint Budget Committee name on a bill unless it has unanimous support from the Joint Budget Committee, which is really interesting because I think that there is a lot of debate and a lot of compromise and a lot of work on a bipartisan level that happens in order to get a bill that everybody agrees to, right? And just because we all agree, I'm not on the Joint Budget Committee, but just because they all agree, doesn't mean that it's a perfect bill. We all know that. There are going to be things that you love and things that you hate, but in the end, it has to be a balanced budget. But here's the interesting thing, another interesting fun fact about the budget. By the way, I always wanted to be on the Joint Budget Committee. I'm glad Rick Taggart took it, but it's definitely a passion of mine. I love budgets. But the fun fact is that in the Constitution, it requires that the state pass a balanced budget. So there can't be a deficit when it's passed. Now, we have reserves that can help offset any deficit, right? But in the end, it has to be a balanced budget. And you have to have reserves that can cover that. But it has to be balanced 2 times in the year. So everyone thinks, and I know the majority and the minority have this debate all the time, but the budget isn't balanced all year long. It is balanced at very specific times when a supplemental happens. And that's when you pass a budget, but then you get grants that you weren't expecting, or there's a loss in revenue you weren't expecting. And so you have to make adjustments to the budget to balance it. And so during the supplemental process, once that's done, you'll have a balanced budget. And when it passes the legislature and the governor signs the bill into law, it is a balanced budget. But then there are things that bring it out of whack. And the Joint Budget Committee has to come back together and they need to figure out how to smooth it out and what the budget is going to look like for next year. And so it is a fascinating committee. If anybody, there's so many really interesting committees at work, and there's some year-long committees. I know there's some agricultural committees that focus on water, and those can be year-long committees. But really important is the Joint Budget Committee. So, the budget, whether it's state or local government, when I was a county commissioner, our biggest policy document, the things that we fund with taxpayer money, that's what the budget is all about, right? This is what we find to be priority for our constituents, for the state. And these are the things we're going to fund with your money. And so it really is a fascinating process. Like I said, I'm a policy geek, so maybe not as fascinating to other people as it might be. But I think where we prioritize taxpayer money says a lot about what our priorities are for the state. Anyway, it's a process you should all at least watch a little bit of because it is really fascinating.
Yeah, I cannot say that I share your same love for those conversations. Some of those committee hearings are some of the most, they're long.
For sure.
And I think it's so interesting, especially for the Joint Budget Committee, that it's made up of both senators and representatives and Democrats and Republicans alike, making sure that every chamber and every voice is represented there. And I do not envy them. Like you said, it is a long time position, full year round, I know I've tried to schedule meetings with Representative Taggart, and he's like, oh, no, I'm already in Denver. Sorry. So it can be definitely hard. And I know that they have a lot of really long hours, even leading into the session itself. And then even more debates when, here they hand you this package and then gets sent back to them and they're like, okay, I guess we'll try to figure this out now. Okay, here we go. But they do such a good job of working together. And like you said, there's that give and take. It's not going to be perfect for everybody. I mean, what in today's world is, right? So you have to be able to find that middle line and work across the aisle to try to make it best for the most people as you can. And, there are things that maybe their constituents don't have concerns about, but others do in a different part of Colorado. And I think just that committee is tasked with a very difficult job. So I do not envy them. Hey, thanks for listening, guys. Please stay tuned for part 2, as this was a longer one and we want to make sure you guys get the full picture of what the legislative session is. We'll see you during part 2 for our Legislative Session 101 podcast coming soon.
Because our way of life is worth protecting. Join Club 20 today. Visit club20.org to learn how.